I found a positive drug test in my kid's bathroom. The truth destroyed our family dinner. I stood frozen in my 3 kids' shared bathroom, staring at the test strip lying next to the toothpaste. THC positive. 2 dark lines. Unmistakable. My hand started shaking as I picked it up. 17 years of coaching Little League, checking homework, teaching them to drive, and one of them had been getting high under my roof. I walked to the dining room slowly, deliberately. My brother Liam was visiting for Sunday dinner, and all 3 kids were laughing at something on Gus's phone. Normal family scene, mashed potatoes steaming, gravy boat making rounds, the smell of roast beef mixing with betrayal. I set the test strip next to the salt shaker. Which one of you is doing drugs? The laughter died instantly. Meal, my oldest at 17, saw it first. His face drained of color. Dad, that's not... Don't. I held up my hand. Someone in this house is using. This was in your bathroom. We're not leaving this table until I get the truth. It's not mine, Meal said, voice cracking. I'm trying to get recruited. D1 school's drug test. I wouldn't throw that away. I turned to Antigone, 15, who had started trembling. Tig? I've never even seen marijuana, she whispered. Then her face crumpled. But I've been selling my Adderall. The silence that followed felt like suffocation. Selling? I heard my own voice from far away. Kids pay $60 a pill during finals. Tears ran down her cheeks. I needed money for therapy because you said anxiety was just weakness. You said I should toughen up like you did. So I found my own way to pay for it. The words hit like physical blows. I opened my mouth, but Meal cut in. Since we're confessing, his jaw tightened. I'm failing calculus. I won't graduate without summer school. And I've been dating someone you won't approve of. What does that mean? His name is Henry. I felt the floor shift beneath me. My son's eyes were defiant, terrified, relieved, all at once. I've been hiding it for 8 months because I knew exactly how you'd react. Same way you reacted when Uncle Liam came out 20 years ago. Remember what you said to him? Because he does. He told me. I looked at Liam. My brother was staring at his plate, fork frozen midair, face pale and sweating. Gus, I said, desperate to redirect. Please tell me you have nothing to confess. My 13-year-old considered this. I run a gambling operation at school. Sports betting, mostly. Made $400 last month. Jesus Christ. You asked. None of this explains the drug test. I grabbed it, waving it at them. Someone is lying. Actually, Gus said, that's not from CVS. That's a professional grade test. 12 panel. They use them at the Riverside Recovery Center on Maple Street. Everyone turned to him. What? I research things. Plus, I saw the same brand in Uncle Liam's bag last week when he was doing laundry. Liam stood so fast his chair crashed backward. His plate shattered on the hardwood, mashed potatoes spraying across the floor like a crime scene. I can explain. His voice was barely audible. The test wasn't my kid's. It was my brother's. I've been clean for 47 days. Liam was crying now, shoulders heaving. I test myself every week, every single week. I must have left it this morning when I used the kids' bathroom because the basement toilet was broken. Clean from what? I asked, though some part of me already knew. The weight loss, the shaking hands, the job loss that brought him here. Oxy. Then heroin when I couldn't afford pills anymore. He laughed brokenly. 47 days. The test was proof I'm getting better. And now, he looked at my children, who were staring at him with something between horror and heartbreak. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. I didn't want anyone to know. I was so ashamed. I stood in my own dining room, surrounded by the wreckage I'd created. My daughter selling pills to afford mental health care I'd denied her. My son hiding his identity because of words I'd said to my own brother 2 decades ago. My youngest running gambling rings because apparently crime was the family business. And my brother, fighting for his life in my basement, while I remained oblivious. The test proves I'm trying, Liam said. 47 days. That's longer than I've ever... Red and blue lights flooded through the dining room windows, pulsing, silent. I looked at Gus. His phone was propped against his water glass. Recording. A live stream counter in the corner showed 47,000 viewers. Gus, what did you do? I didn't mean to. Someone must have called. The doorbell rang, then pounding. Police! We're responding to a report of drug activity and minors in potential danger. Liam looked at me. 47 days of recovery about to be destroyed by a viral video. Antigone was hyperventilating. Meal had his arm around her, his own confession still hanging in the air between us. I had come to this table looking for the truth. I found it. And now the whole world had too. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, and my legs felt like they might give out as I pushed myself up from the table. The dining room felt too bright under those pulsing red and blue lights, and I could see all 5 of them sitting there frozen, like we were in some kind of nightmare. Gus's phone was still propped up against his water glass. The viewer count had climbed past 52,000. I grabbed it with shaking hands and fumbled with the screen until the live stream ended, but my stomach dropped when I saw the recording had already been saved and shared dozens of times. The damage was permanent now, spreading across the internet while police pounded on my front door. I walked through the dining room in a daze, my feet crunching on the broken plate shards and dried mashed potatoes that were still scattered across the hardwood. Meal had his arm around Antigone, who was breathing too fast, her face buried against his shoulder. Liam sat with his head in his hands, his whole body shaking. I reached the front door and pulled it open to find two officers standing on my porch with their flashlights pointed at my face. The older one was maybe 50 with gray at his temples and hard eyes that scanned past me into the house. His partner was younger, maybe 30, with his hand resting on his radio like he was ready to call for backup. They both looked at me with that professional cop face that gave away nothing. The older officer spoke first, asking if everyone inside was safe and unharmed. I nodded and tried to explain, but my voice came out wrong, too high and shaky. He asked how many people were in the house, and I told him 5, my 3 kids, and my brother and me. The younger officer asked if anyone needed medical attention, and I shook my head. Then they asked to come inside, and I stepped back to let them through, watching as their eyes moved across the dining room, taking in everything at once. The shattered plate, the food going cold on the table, Liam's tear-streaked face, my 3 kids huddled together looking scared, the drug test still sitting next to the salt shaker like evidence at a crime scene. The older officer introduced himself, but I barely heard his name over the rushing sound in my ears. He asked us all to stay calm and said they needed to talk to everyone separately to understand what was happening. A third officer arrived, a woman in her 40s who must have been the backup the younger cop had called for. She walked into the dining room with the same careful assessment in her eyes, looking at each of my kids like she was trying to figure out if they were in danger. The older officer pointed Meal toward the living room and told him to wait there. He directed Antigone to the kitchen with the female officer. Gus stayed at the dining table with the younger cop pulling out a chair across from him. Liam and I were told to remain in the dining room, and I watched helplessly as my family got separated into different rooms, like we were suspects in our own house. The roast beef sat congealing in its juices, the gravy forming a skin on top, and I thought about how we'd never finish this meal, how Sunday dinners might never be the same again. The older officer sat down across from me at the dining room table and pulled out a small notebook. He asked me to explain what happened tonight and why someone had called in a report about drug activity and minors in potential danger. My voice shook as I tried to tell the story, starting with finding the drug test in the bathroom and confronting my kids at dinner. It sounded insane coming out of my mouth, like I was describing someone else's life instead of my own. I explained that the test wasn't my kids at all, that it belonged to my brother who was in recovery and testing himself weekly to prove he was staying clean. The officer's expression didn't change as he wrote notes, just kept asking questions in that neutral cop voice. He wanted to know how long Liam had been staying with us, and I admitted I didn't know about his addiction until tonight, that he'd been living in my basement for weeks, while I remained completely clueless. The officer asked if there were any drugs in the house currently, and I said no, that the test proved Liam was clean, that 47 days meant he wasn't using anymore. He wrote that down too, his pen scratching across the page while I sat there feeling like the worst father and brother in the world. In the kitchen, I could hear Antigone's voice rising and falling, too quiet to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. She was crying as she talked to the female officer, probably explaining about the Adderall and the $60 per pill and how she needed money for therapy I'd refused to pay for. I couldn't see them from where I sat, but I imagined the officer's face changing as my daughter admitted to selling prescription medication, her body language shifting from suspicious to concerned. Antigone would be explaining how I'd called her anxiety weakness, how I'd told her to toughen up instead of getting her actual help. The officer was probably wondering what kind of father drives his kid to commit crimes just to afford basic mental health care. I wanted to stand up and go to her, to apologize again, to fix this somehow, but the older officer kept asking me questions, and I had to stay in my seat and answer while my daughter confessed her desperation to a stranger. Meal sat on the living room couch with his back rigid, and I could see him through the doorway talking to the younger officer. His hands were clasped between his knees, and his voice was low but steady as he explained about Henry, about hiding their relationship for 8 months because of things I'd said to Liam 2 decades ago. The officer was taking notes and asking questions, and then he said something that made Meal go very still. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I saw Meal's face, the way he hesitated before answering, and I knew the officer had asked if he felt safe at home. The pause before Neil said yes lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity, like watching something inside my chest break apart into pieces I couldn't put back together. My son had to think about whether he felt safe in his own house, had to consider his answer before telling a police officer that his father wasn't a threat. That hesitation said everything about what I'd done to him, how my words from 20 years ago had poisoned the air he breathed every day under my roof. Gus sat across from the female officer at the dining table with his ledger open in front of him, the same notebook I'd thought he was using for homework. He explained his gambling operation matter-of-factly, showing her the columns of numbers and names with the same organizational skills he'd applied to running an illegal betting ring at the school. The officer asked where he learned to do this, and Gus just shrugged, his face blank as he said he taught himself, because no one was paying attention anyway. His voice held no emotion, like he was describing someone else's life instead of admitting to crimes he'd committed at age 13. The officer wrote everything down and asked more questions about how much money he'd made and who was involved and whether any adults knew about it. Gus answered each question with the same detached efficiency, and I realized my youngest son had learned to shut down his feelings completely, to operate like a tiny criminal mastermind, because emotional connection wasn't available in our house. The 3 officers eventually regrouped in our hallway, leaving us sitting separated in our different rooms. I could hear their voices speaking low, but not the actual words, just the serious tone that made my stomach clench with fear. Then I caught phrases floating back toward the dining room, words like CPS notification and mandatory reporting that made my hands start shaking again. I looked across at Liam and saw him trembling, his face pale and sweating, 47 days of sobriety about to be threatened by police reports and public exposure, and the stress of everything falling apart. He met my eyes, and I saw the fear there, the knowledge that shame was a relapse trigger his sponsor had warned him about, that tonight could destroy all his progress if he wasn't careful. The officers kept talking in the hallway, and I heard something about prescription medication sales and minors at risk and home environment assessment, each phrase landing like a punch to my chest. The lead officer finally came back into the dining room and sat down across from Liam and me. He explained in that same neutral voice that no one was arrested tonight, that they understood the situation was complicated and involved family issues more than criminal intent. But then he said they were required by law to file reports about certain things, specifically Antigone's admission to selling her prescription medication and Gus's gambling operation at the school. His partner was already contacting CPS to notify them of the situation, and a caseworker would be reaching out within 48 hours to schedule a home visit and assess whether the children were safe in this environment. He said this like it was routine, like having CPS investigate your family was just a normal Tuesday, but the words made my throat close up with panic. They were going to come into my house and interview my kids and decide if I was fit to be their father, and I had no good defense, because everything they'd find would prove I'd already failed at the job. After the officers left, we gathered in the living room because none of us could stand to be in the dining room anymore, with its cold food and broken dishes and the ghost of that live stream still hanging in the air. We sat in terrible silence, not looking at each other, while my phone started buzzing with notifications, text messages and Facebook messages and missed calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years, all wanting to know if that viral video was really us, if this was actually our family imploding on the internet for entertainment. I watched the notifications pile up and didn't answer any of them because what could I possibly say? Yes, that's us. That's my daughter admitting to drug dealing, and my son coming out to 50,000 strangers, and my brother's addiction exposed for the world to judge. The video was still spreading across platforms I didn't even know about, being shared and commented on and turned into memes probably, our worst moment becoming content for people who didn't know us and didn't care about anything except the drama. Liam sat with his phone showing his recovery app, staring at the number 47 like it meant nothing now, like all that progress had just been erased by public humiliation and family chaos and the shame of everyone knowing his secrets. I watched my brother disappear down the basement stairs, and something pulled me to follow. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I descended into the dimly lit space where Liam had been living for the past 2 months. He sat on the edge of his bed, hunched over his phone with his shoulders trembling. The screen glowed blue in the darkness, and I could see the recovery app he had open, the number 47 displayed in large white digits. He looked up when I reached the bottom step, and his eyes were wet and empty at the same time. The devastation in his face hit me harder than anything that happened at dinner. He kept staring at that number like it meant nothing anymore, like all those days of fighting and struggling had just been erased by 50,000 strangers watching his shame get broadcast across the internet. I stood there not knowing what to say, because what words could possibly fix this? The silence stretched between us, and I heard the house settling above our heads, heard muffled sounds of my kids moving around upstairs in their rooms. Liam's hands were shaking as he held the phone, and I noticed how thin his fingers looked, how the bones showed through his skin in a way they never used to. He had always been bigger than me growing up, broader and stronger, but addiction had carved him down to something fragile. I crossed the basement and sat beside him on the bed. The mattress dipped under our combined weight, and our shoulders touched. I could feel him trembling, and I realized I was shaking too. 20 years of words I should have said sat between us, and I didn't know how to start untangling that mess. But I had to try, because my son was upstairs right now, believing that coming out meant rejection, and Liam was the reason he believed that. Not because of who Liam was, but because of what I said to him. The memory came back sharp and clear, even though I had tried to bury it for 2 decades. Liam standing in our parents' kitchen at 23 years old, telling the family he was gay, and me responding with words that felt justified at the time, but now burned like acid in my throat. I told him he was making a choice to be difficult. I told him he was throwing away a normal life for attention. I told him I didn't want my future kids exposed to that lifestyle. And then I didn't speak to him for 3 years. My father had to mediate our reconciliation, and even after we started talking again, we never discussed what I said. We just pretended it never happened, and built a careful surface relationship on top of that wound. I opened my mouth, and the apology came out rough and broken. I told him I was sorry for what I said when he came out. I told him I was wrong about everything, and I had been carrying that shame for 20 years, but I was too proud to admit it. Liam's face crumpled, and he started crying again. Harder this time, his whole body shaking with sobs that sounded like they were tearing him apart. He told me through the tears that he thought about using tonight. He said the shame of his addiction being exposed like this was almost worse than the addiction itself, because at least when it was secret, he could pretend he had some control. Now everyone knew, and he felt stripped bare and judged, and he just wanted to make it stop. He said there were pills in his jacket pocket from months ago, before rehab, and he found them this morning and almost took them. The only thing that stopped him was thinking about that number on his app, about 47 days of progress that would disappear if he gave in. But now that progress felt meaningless anyway, because the whole world knew his secret, and what was the point of being sober if everyone was going to treat him like a junkie regardless? I put my arm around my brother, and he leaned into me like he used to when we were kids, and he had a nightmare. We sat like that for a long time while he cried, and I tried to find words that would help, but everything I thought of sounded empty. Finally, I just started talking. I told him about watching Neil grow up and seeing glimpses of the same sensitivity Liam had as a kid, the same gentleness that I tried to crush out of both of them because I thought it made people weak. I told him about the day Neil asked me what I thought about gay people, when he was 14, and I gave him some carefully neutral answer that I thought was progressive, not realizing he was asking because he needed to know if I would still love him. I told him I failed both of them by being so rigid and scared of anything that didn't fit my narrow idea of normal. Liam listened, and eventually his crying slowed to occasional shudders. He wiped his face with his sleeve and asked if I really meant the apology, or if I was just saying it because everything was falling apart. I told him I meant it, and I should have said it 20 years ago, and I was sorry it took our family imploding for me to finally be honest. We stayed up until 3 in the morning talking about things we should have discussed decades ago. The house was quiet above us, and I knew my kids were probably lying awake in their rooms processing everything that happened. But I couldn't go up there yet, because Liam was finally telling me the truth about his life, and I needed to hear it. He told me about losing his job 6 months ago because he kept showing up high and missing deadlines. He told me about the overdose that nearly killed him 3 months back, how he woke up in the hospital with Clive sitting beside his bed and realized he had a choice between getting clean or dying. He told me about checking himself into rehab with money he borrowed from people I didn't know because he was too ashamed to ask family. He said he spent 30 days in treatment, learning that addiction was a disease, not a moral failure, but the shame still felt like it was eating him alive. He talked about the daily struggle of staying sober, how every morning he had to make the choice again not to use, how some days that choice felt impossible, but he made it anyway. He showed me the recovery app on his phone and explained how tracking his days gave him something concrete to hold on to when everything else felt like it was falling apart. 47 days used to feel like an achievement, but now it just felt like a number that proved how far he still had to go. I asked him what he needed from me, and he said he needed me to stop judging him for being human. He said he needed me to understand that he was trying his best, and some days his best was just getting through without using. He needed me to be present instead of distant, and he needed me to actually listen instead of waiting for my turn to lecture. I promised I would try to. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. Trust had to be rebuilt through actions, not words, and we both knew that. The conversation eventually wound down, and Liam laid back on his bed, fully clothed. I stood to leave, but he asked me to stay a little longer, so I sat in the chair by his desk and watched him fall into an exhausted sleep. His face looked younger when he slept, less worn down by everything he was carrying. I thought about all the years I wasted being angry at him for being himself and felt sick with regret. But regret didn't fix anything, so I made myself focus on what I could do differently, starting now. The next morning came too early. I heard movement upstairs around 7 and dragged myself up from the basement where I had eventually fallen asleep in the chair. My back ached, and my head felt full of cotton, but I forced myself to make coffee and face whatever came next. Meal was already in the kitchen when I got there, his phone in his hand and his face pale. He didn't look up when I walked in, and I could see his thumb scrolling through something on the screen. I poured coffee and asked if he was okay, and he finally looked at me with eyes that were red from crying, or lack of sleep, or both. He turned his phone around to show me a group chat with what looked like 30 people in it. The messages were brutal. Kids from his school making jokes about his family, about him being gay, about whether he would even show up Monday, or if he was too embarrassed. Someone had started a betting pool on it. Another person posted a screenshot from the viral video with Meal's face circled, and the caption saying he looked like he was going to cry. The cruelty was casual and constant, and I watched my son's face close off as he scrolled through more messages. Some kids were being supportive, but those messages were buried under the mean ones. I asked if he wanted to stay home Monday, and he shook his head. He said hiding would just make it worse, and he had to face it eventually, so he might as well get it over with. His voice was flat and emotionless, and I recognized that tone from my own teenage years, when I learned to shut down feelings that made me vulnerable. I tried to think of something helpful to say, but Antigone's door slammed upstairs, and I heard her footsteps running to the bathroom. I went upstairs and knocked on her door but got no answer. I knocked again and called her name, and finally her voice came through the door, telling me to go away. I said I just wanted to make sure she was okay, and she laughed, but it sounded more like crying. She told me through the door that kids from her school already found the video and were calling her a drug dealer. She said someone posted in their class group chat asking if anyone wanted to buy pills from her, and now everyone was making jokes about it. She said she couldn't go back to the school and face them, and she didn't want to face me either, because this was all my fault. I tried the handle, but she had locked it. I stood there feeling useless and heard her crying on the other side of the door. She told me to leave her alone, and after a few minutes I did, because I didn't know what else to do. I went back downstairs and found Gus at the kitchen table eating cereal like nothing had happened. He was scrolling through comments on the viral video with the same detached interest he might show reading about sports scores. I sat down across from him and asked if he was okay. He looked at me like I had asked something stupid and said he was fine. I pointed out that our family just fell apart on the internet, and he shrugged. He said at least now everyone knew the truth, and we didn't have to pretend anymore. He said our fake normal family was exhausting to maintain, and he was glad it was over. The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, made my chest hurt. I asked if he understood that what happened last night was serious, and he rolled his eyes. He told me he understood perfectly, and he also understood that I only cared now because other people were watching. He said I had been checked out for years, and one viral video wasn't going to magically turn me into a good father. Then he went back to his cereal like he hadn't just gutted me with the truth. I sat there not knowing how to respond, because he was right. I had been checked out and distant, and now I was trying to fix things because we got caught, not because I genuinely cared enough to notice before. My phone started ringing, and I saw my father's name on the screen. My stomach dropped because I knew exactly why he was calling. I answered, and his voice came through tight with controlled anger. He asked if that viral video was really us, and I confirmed it was. He said someone from his church sent it to him, asking if that was his family, and he had to watch his granddaughter admit to selling drugs, and his son come out to strangers, and his other son reveal an addiction none of us knew about. His voice got louder as he talked, and I could hear my mother in the background asking questions. He said he and Maggie were driving up today because clearly I needed help managing my household. I tried to tell him that wasn't necessary, but he cut me off. He said it was absolutely necessary because I had obviously lost control of my family, and my children needed adults who could actually take care of them. He said they would be there by noon and hung up before I could argue. I sat holding my phone and feeling like a teenager being called to the principal's office. Gus watched this conversation with interest and asked if Grandpa was mad. I told him yes, and Gus nodded like that made sense. I realized I needed to call work and explain that I needed time off. I dialed my boss and tried to figure out how to summarize the situation without admitting my family had imploded on the internet for entertainment. He answered on the second ring, and I started explaining that I had a family emergency and needed a few days off. He interrupted me to say he already saw the video. My stomach dropped, and he continued talking in that careful professional tone people use when they are trying not to sound judgmental, but absolutely are. He said HR wanted to meet with me when I returned because my daughter's admission to selling prescription drugs reflected poorly on the company. He said they understood this was a personal matter, but I represented the company, and they needed to discuss how this might impact my position. I said I understood, and we could meet whenever they wanted. He told me to take the time I needed and hung up. I sat there processing that my job might be in danger now too, and added it to the growing list of consequences from last night. Liam came upstairs looking worse than he had last night. His hands shook as he made coffee, and he moved slowly like every action required enormous effort. I asked if he slept at all, and he said no. He said his sponsor called this morning after seeing the video, and they talked for an hour about shame being a relapse trigger. His sponsor reminded him that recovery was about progress, not perfection, and one bad night didn't erase 47 days of work. But Liam said it didn't feel that way, and he was struggling to believe staying sober was worth it when everyone knew his secret anyway. I told him it was worth it, and he needed to keep going, and he nodded, but I could see he didn't believe me. He took his coffee and went back downstairs, and I let him go because I didn't know how to help him. My parents arrived at noon exactly. I heard their car pull into the driveway and watched through the window as they got out. My mother looked worried, and my father looked furious. I opened the door before they could knock, and my mother immediately asked where the kids were. I told her Meal was in his room, Antigone locked herself in her room and wouldn't come out, and Gus was in the living room. She went straight upstairs without another word. My father walked past me into the house and sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at me and asked how I let things get this bad. His voice was calm, but I heard the anger underneath. He asked how I didn't notice my daughter was desperate enough to commit crimes. He asked how I missed that my son was failing school and hiding his identity. He asked how I could have my brother living in my basement dying from addiction and not see it. I didn't have good answers that wouldn't make me sound negligent, so I just stood there taking it. He said I had always been stubborn and rigid, but he thought I would be a better father than this. He said watching that video broke his heart because he saw 3 kids who were hurting and a father who was too blind to notice. I told him he was right about everything, and I was trying to fix it now. He said trying wasn't enough, and I needed to actually do better starting immediately. I stayed at the kitchen table after my father finished, his words settling over me like concrete. Maggie came downstairs and went straight to Antigone's room. I heard her knock softly and say she just wanted to talk. No answer. She tried again, her voice patient in a way mine never was. She said she knew Antigone was scared and hurting, but hiding wouldn't make it better. She promised she wasn't there to judge or lecture, just to listen. After what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes, I heard the lock click. The door opened. Maggie slipped inside and closed it behind her. I sat there straining to hear through the floor, catching only the muffled sound of my daughter's voice rising and falling, then clearer, louder, sobbing that made my chest hurt. Antigone was saying something about school, about the video, about everyone knowing. Maggie's response was too quiet to make out, but the tone was gentle, patient, everything I should have been. I heard my mother explaining something, her voice steady and calm. The crying gradually quieted. When Maggie came back downstairs 20 minutes later, her eyes were red. She told me Antigone was convinced everyone at the school thought she was insane now. The video made her sound crazy for needing therapy, made her anxiety seem like weakness, just like I always said it was. Kids had already started messaging her, some concerned but others mocking. Maggie said she tried to explain that needing help wasn't weakness, that lots of people needed therapy, and it didn't make them broken. She said she could see Antigone wanted to believe it, but years of my voice in her head made it hard. Around 3 that afternoon, I heard a sound from upstairs that made my blood freeze. Antigone was hyperventilating, gasping for air in a way that didn't sound human. Maggie ran up the stairs faster than I'd seen her move in years. I followed and found Antigone on her bedroom floor, knees pulled to her chest, shaking so hard the whole bed frame rattled. Her face was white except for 2 bright red spots on her cheeks. Sweat soaked through her shirt. She kept trying to say something but couldn't get enough air. Maggie knelt beside her and started talking in that same calm voice, telling her to breathe with her, in for 4 counts. Hold for 4, out for 4. Antigone couldn't do it. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, looking at something I couldn't see. Maggie looked at me and said we needed to take her to the emergency room right now. I picked up Antigone, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile. She didn't fight me. We got her to the car, and Maggie sat in back holding her hand while I drove. Antigone's breathing got worse at every red light. At the hospital, they took her back immediately when Maggie explained what was happening. A crisis counselor came within minutes, a woman with short gray hair who introduced herself and started asking Antigone questions in a voice that expected honest answers. How long had she felt this way? Had she ever had an attack this bad before? Was she on any medication? Antigone answered between gasps, admitting she'd been having smaller attacks for months, but this was the worst. The counselor asked if she was currently in therapy, and Antigone shook her head. The counselor looked at me and asked why not. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out that wouldn't make me sound like exactly what I was. Maggie stepped in and explained about the Adderall selling, about Antigone trying to pay for therapy herself because I refused to get her help. The counselor's expression didn't change, but I felt the judgment anyway. She asked me directly why I didn't think my daughter needed treatment. I said I thought she just needed to toughen up, that anxiety was something you pushed through. The counselor wrote something on her clipboard and said that approach had clearly worked well. Her sarcasm was professional, but unmistakable. The counselor spent another 30 minutes with Antigone, while Maggie and I waited in chairs that were designed to be uncomfortable. Finally, a doctor came out. Older guy with tired eyes, who'd probably seen this exact situation 100 times. He sat down across from us and explained that Antigone's anxiety had likely been building for years, that untreated anxiety in teenagers often got worse until something triggered a crisis. He said the Adderall selling wasn't criminal behavior, it was desperation. A kid trying to solve a problem the adults in her life refused to acknowledge. He asked if we understood how serious this was, that Antigone could have hurt herself trying to manage this alone. He gave us referrals for 3 therapists who worked with teenagers, all women with experience in anxiety disorders. He made Antigone promise before we left that she'd follow up within the week. His tone made clear this wasn't a suggestion. Antigone nodded, still pale but breathing normally now. The doctor looked at me one more time and said parents often didn't realize how much damage they could do by dismissing mental health. Then he left us sitting there with our paperwork and shame. We got home around 6 to find Meal in his room throwing clothes into a duffel bag. Oscar was standing in the doorway trying to convince him to stay. Meal wasn't listening. He said he couldn't be in this house right now, couldn't handle the tension and the judgment and the constant feeling that everything was falling apart. Oscar said running away wouldn't solve anything. Meal said he wasn't running away, he was going to stay with a friend for a few days until he could think straight. I came up behind Oscar and put my hand on his shoulder. I told Meal he could go if he needed space. Oscar looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but I kept my eyes on my son. I said I understood why he didn't want to be here, that I got it. Meal stopped packing and stared at me. He asked if I was serious. I said yes. If he needed distance from this family right now, from me, I wasn't going to force him to stay. The surprise on his face made me realize how little I'd ever let him make his own choices. Meal zipped his bag slowly, like he was waiting for me to change my mind. Then he turned and asked if he could bring Henry over tomorrow. Not to sneak around or hide anymore, but to actually meet us properly. To introduce his boyfriend to his family like a normal person instead of having Henry learn about us through a viral video that made us look insane. I felt my stomach clench at the word boyfriend, but I nodded. I said yes, bring him over. We'd have dinner, talk, do this right. Meal's eyes searched my face for signs I was lying or setting a trap. I tried to keep my expression open, even though every instinct wanted to argue or set conditions. This was my problem to fix, not his. My discomfort was my responsibility to manage. Meal picked up his bag and walked past me without another word. I heard the front door close a minute later. That night my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. A woman's voice introduced herself as the principal at Gus's middle school. My stomach dropped. She said she needed to meet with me Monday morning about the gambling operation Gus mentioned in the video. Multiple parents had called the school demanding to know if their children were involved, if the school knew this was happening, what the district planned to do about it. She said they took illegal activity seriously, even when it happened off campus. Her voice was professional, but I heard the anger underneath. She asked if 9 o'clock worked. I said yes. She said to bring Gus and hung up. I sat there holding the phone, adding this to the list of consequences that kept growing. Gus was in the living room playing a video game, his face blank and focused like the last 24 hours hadn't happened. I told him about the meeting. He paused the game and shrugged. He said he figured something like that was coming. Then he went back to playing. Sunday morning, Liam came upstairs looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His hands shook so bad he could barely hold his coffee mug. He asked if he could go to a recovery meeting. Oscar looked up from the newspaper and said he'd drive him. Liam looked shocked. Oscar said, "What? He couldn't take his brother to a meeting?" They left together, the first time they'd spent time alone in probably 15 years. I watched through the window as they got in the car, Liam's shoulders tight with nerves, Oscar's face set in that expression he got when he was trying not to show emotion. I realized Liam needed support that wasn't contaminated by my judgment, wasn't weighed down by my failures as a brother and father. Maybe Oscar could give him that. Maybe I'd poisoned my relationship with Liam so badly that the best thing I could do was step back and let someone else help him. I spent the afternoon on the phone calling therapists for Antigone. The first one had a waiting list of 6 weeks. The second said 2 months. The third asked if this was an emergency, and when I explained the situation, she said she'd put Antigone on the cancellation list, but couldn't promise anything soon. Adolescent mental health care was overwhelmed in our area, she said. Too many kids needed help, and not enough therapists to provide it. The fourth therapist didn't even have a waiting list, just said she wasn't taking new patients. I was about to give up when the fifth one answered. I explained about the panic attack, the ER visit, the video, everything. There was a pause, and then she said she had an opening Tuesday because of a cancellation. She could see Antigone at 4 if we could make that work. I said yes immediately. She asked a few questions about Antigone's history, and I admitted I didn't know most of the answers because I'd never paid attention. The therapist said that was honest at least. She gave me her address and told me to have Antigone ready to talk. I hung up feeling like I'd accomplished one small thing in a sea of failures. Neil came home late Sunday evening with Henry. I heard them come in through the front door, heard Neil's voice low and nervous as he brought Henry into the living room. I stood up from the couch where I'd been pretending to watch TV. Henry was shorter than I expected, with dark curly hair and brown eyes that looked scared but determined. He held out his hand and I shook it. His grip was firm. I invited them to sit down, and we all arranged ourselves awkwardly on furniture we'd sat on 1,000 times, but that suddenly felt unfamiliar. I looked at my son and his boyfriend and forced myself to start talking. I said I was sorry for making Neil feel like he couldn't be himself in his own home. Sorry for the things I said to Liam 20 years ago that shaped how Neil learned to hide. Sorry that his coming out happened during a viral disaster instead of on his own terms. Neil watched me carefully, looking for cracks in my sincerity. I tried to show through my posture and tone that I meant it, even though the words felt clumsy and inadequate. Henry spoke up then, his voice quiet but steady. He said he'd known he was gay since middle school. His parents found out when he was 13, and they'd been supportive from the start. They went to Pride with him, met his boyfriends, treated his identity like it was normal and unremarkable because it was. He said it with simple matter-of-fact honesty that made me realize what Neil had lost by having me as a father instead of someone like Henry's parents. Neil kept his eyes on me during this whole conversation, watching for any sign I was faking acceptance or just performing for Henry. I sat there trying to be present, trying to listen instead of planning what to say next, trying to show through my actions that I was genuinely attempting to change even though I was uncomfortable and didn't have all the answers. We talked for another hour, awkward but honest, and when they left to go upstairs, I felt like maybe I'd done one thing right that day. Monday morning, I walked into the school administration building with Gus beside me, his backpack hanging off one shoulder like any other day. The principal's secretary waved us through to the conference room where the principal and school counselor already sat waiting at a long table. They gestured for us to sit, and I pulled out a chair while Gus dropped into the one beside me, slouching immediately. The principal folded her hands on the table and started talking about the gambling operation, saying they'd received calls from concerned parents who saw the video. She explained that while the betting happened off school property, they were worried about Gus's judgment and what might be happening at home to make a 13-year-old seek money and control through illegal activity. The counselor leaned forward and asked directly if there were problems at home, if Gus felt unsafe or unsupported, if something was driving this behavior. I opened my mouth to defend myself but stopped, because what could I say that wasn't a lie? I admitted I'd been emotionally absent, that I'd failed to notice what was happening with all my kids until everything exploded at once. The counselor wrote something in her notes, and the principal's expression shifted from stern to concerned. She said they were assigning Gus to mandatory counseling sessions with the school counselor twice a week, starting immediately. She added that he was suspended from all extracurricular activities for the semester, which meant no soccer, no robotics club, nothing. Gus sat there taking this news without any visible reaction, his face blank like he was hearing about someone else's punishment. The counselor noted this out loud, saying it was concerning that a kid his age showed no emotional response to serious consequences. She asked Gus how he felt about the suspension, and he shrugged, saying he'd expected worse. The meeting ended with paperwork I had to sign and a schedule for Gus's counseling sessions printed on bright yellow paper that felt too cheerful for the situation. The phone rang Tuesday afternoon while I was making lunch, a number I didn't recognize with a local area code. I answered, and a man's voice introduced himself as Manfred Wagner from Child Protective Services. He said he was calling to schedule a home visit for Wednesday, explaining in a calm, professional tone that he needed to interview each family member separately and assess whether the children were in a safe environment. I gripped the phone tighter and said Wednesday would be fine, whatever time worked for him. He suggested 1 in the afternoon and I agreed, writing it down on the calendar even though I knew I wouldn't forget. His tone stayed professional throughout, but I heard the implicit threat underneath every word, the suggestion that my family could be separated if he determined I was unfit. He asked me to make sure all the children would be home and that Liam would be available for an interview as well. After hanging up, I stood in the kitchen staring at the calendar with Wednesday circled in red ink, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to imagine how those interviews would go. Tuesday morning, I found Liam sitting on the basement stairs with his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. I walked down and sat beside him, asking what happened. He pulled a small pill bottle from his jacket pocket, the kind with a pharmacy label peeling at the edges. He said he'd found it that morning when he was looking for his phone charger, pills he'd forgotten about from months ago before rehab. His voice cracked as he explained that for maybe 30 seconds, he'd held them and thought about taking them, about how easy it would be to make everything stop hurting, but instead, he'd called his sponsor immediately, talking on the phone for an hour until the urge passed. Tears ran down his face as he told me 49 days sober felt both like forever and like nothing, that every single day was a choice he had to make again. He said seeing those pills reminded him how close he always was to using, how fragile his recovery really was, despite the progress he'd made. I put my arm around his shoulders, and we sat there on the stairs while he cried, the pill bottle sitting between us like evidence of how hard he was fighting to stay alive. Maggie drove Antigone to her first therapy appointment Tuesday afternoon, because Antigone made it clear she didn't want me there. I waited at home, pacing the living room and checking my phone every few minutes until they returned. Antigone went straight to her room without speaking to me, and Maggie said the appointment went well, that the therapist seemed competent and kind. An hour later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The therapist, Georgia Ferguson, introduced herself and said she wanted to schedule a parent session with me, explaining that she needed to understand the family dynamics that contributed to Antigone's crisis. Her voice was professional, but I heard the judgment underneath, the implication that I'd caused my daughter's breakdown through neglect and dismissal. We scheduled an appointment for Thursday afternoon, and she asked me to come prepared to discuss my parenting approach and my views on mental health. After hanging up, I sat on the couch feeling like I was drowning in appointments and interviews, each one another chance to be evaluated and found wanting. Wednesday afternoon, Manfred Wagner arrived exactly at 1, a man in his 40s with graying hair and a briefcase that looked well used. I let him in, and he shook my hand with a firm grip before asking to speak with each child individually. He started with Antigone, taking her into the dining room and closing the door. An hour passed before he emerged and called for meal, then another hour before Gus went in. I sat in the living room trying not to imagine what they were saying, what details they were sharing about their home life, and my failures as a father. Liam went last, and I heard Manfred asking pointed questions about his addiction and recovery, about whether having an addict in the home put the children at risk. Liam's answers were quiet, and I couldn't make out the words through the door. Finally, Manfred called me into the dining room and gestured for me to sit across from him at the table where this whole disaster had started days ago. Manfred opened a notebook and looked at me with an expression that gave nothing away. He said he had concerns about my parenting based on what he'd heard from the children. He listed them methodically, his voice steady and professional. I'd dismissed Antigone's mental health needs, telling her anxiety was weakness instead of getting her proper help. I'd failed to notice Meal's distress about his identity, creating an environment where he felt he had to hide who he was for 8 months. I'd been so checked out emotionally that Gus built an entire illegal gambling operation without my knowledge or intervention. He asked me to respond to these concerns, and I couldn't defend myself because everything he was saying was true. Instead, I focused on explaining what I was doing to fix it, the therapy appointments I'd scheduled, the conversations I was having with each kid, the family dinners we were starting. I told him about Liam's recovery and how I was learning to support him properly instead of judging him. Manfred wrote everything down in his notebook, his pen moving steadily across the page while I talked. When I finished, Manfred closed his notebook and explained that he wasn't removing the children from the home today. Relief flooded through me, but he held up his hand, saying I shouldn't celebrate yet. He was putting me on a family service plan that required therapy for everyone, regular check-ins with him, and proof that I was addressing the issues he'd identified. He said he'd be monitoring our progress closely and would return in 6 weeks to reassess the situation. His tone made it clear this was my one chance to fix things, that if I failed or backslid, he wouldn't hesitate to take more serious action. He handed me paperwork, outlining the requirements of the service plan, and I signed it with shaking hands, knowing I'd just been given a lifeline I didn't deserve, but desperately needed. That evening after Manfred left, I knocked on Antigone's door and asked if we could talk. She opened it slowly, and I sat on her bed while she stayed by her desk, arms crossed. I apologized properly this time, not the defensive half-apology I'd given during the police interviews, but a real acknowledgement of how I'd failed her. I said I was sorry for dismissing her anxiety, for telling her to toughen up when she needed help, for forcing her into a situation where she felt selling pills was her only option. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me she'd been anxious since she was 10 years old. She said the first time she'd asked for help, I'd told her anxiety was just weakness, that she needed to push through it like I had. She'd stopped asking after that, learning to hide her panic attacks and manage her fear alone until it became too much. Her voice shook as she described lying awake at night, convinced something terrible was going to happen, her heart racing so fast she thought she might die. I sat there listening to my daughter describe years of suffering I'd ignored and dismissed, feeling the full weight of what my rigid beliefs had cost her. I found Neil in the garage working on his car, music playing from his phone on the workbench. I asked if we could talk and he turned down the music but kept his hands busy with a socket wrench. I apologized for making him feel like he couldn't be himself at home, for the words I'd said to Liam 20 years ago that shaped how Neil learned to hide. I told him I was sorry his coming out happened during a viral disaster instead of on his own terms. Sorry he'd spent 8 months hiding Henry because of my prejudice. Neil set down the wrench and looked at me directly. He said those 8 months had been exhausting, deleting texts and lying about where he was going, loving someone in secret because of words I'd said before he was even born. He described the constant fear of being discovered, the careful management of his phone and social media, the elaborate stories he'd constructed to hide the truth. He said Henry had wanted to meet the family months ago, but Neil had kept putting it off because he knew exactly how I'd react. His voice was steady, but I could hear the hurt underneath. He said he wasn't sure he could trust me yet, that words were easy, but he needed to see actual change over time. He was willing to try if I actually followed through instead of just performing acceptance until things got uncomfortable. I told him that was fair, and I'd prove it through my actions, knowing that was all I could offer right now. I knocked on Gus's door around 9 that night and found him at his desk doing homework like nothing had happened. He looked up when I came in but didn't say anything, just waited for me to start talking. I sat on the edge of his bed and apologized for being absent, for not noticing he needed attention until he built an entire illegal business to get it. He listened without expression, and when I finished, he set down his pencil and turned his chair to face me. He said actions matter more than words, that he'd believe I changed when he saw it consistently over time, not just for a few days after getting caught. His voice was flat, matter of fact, like he was explaining a math problem instead of telling me he didn't trust me. I asked what I could do to prove it, and he shrugged, said he'd know it when he saw it, that he wasn't going to give me a checklist to follow. The cynicism in his voice hurt, but I couldn't argue with it. My 13-year-old had learned not to trust adults because I taught him that lesson through years of neglect. He went back to his homework, and I sat there for another minute before leaving, realizing my youngest son had already figured out what his siblings were still learning. Words were cheap. Only consistent action would matter. Thursday morning, my brother Clive showed up at the door with 2 suitcases and a week off work. He hugged me briefly, then asked where Liam was, heading straight for the basement stairs before I could answer. I followed him down and found them embracing in the middle of the room, Clive holding Liam like he might disappear if he let go. They talked in low voices, and I backed up the stairs to give them privacy, watching through the doorway as they sat on the bed together. Liam was crying again, and Clive had his arm around him, their heads bent close together in conversation I couldn't hear. Later that afternoon, I looked out the kitchen window and saw them in the backyard, sitting in the lawn chairs my wife bought years ago. They were laughing about something, their body language easy and comfortable, in a way I'd never achieved with either of them. Clive said something that made Liam double over laughing, the sound carrying through the open window, and I felt a stab of jealousy mixed with relief that Liam had someone who made recovery feel less impossible. That evening, Clive found me in the garage and asked if we could talk. We stood by my workbench and he told me straight out that Liam almost died 3 months ago. Overdose. ICU for 2 days. Clive was the one who sat with him because Liam was too ashamed to tell me he'd hit rock bottom that hard. The words hit like punches, and I grabbed the edge of the workbench to steady myself. Clive described finding Liam unconscious in his apartment, calling 911, riding in the ambulance while Liam's heart stopped twice. He said the doctors weren't sure Liam would make it through the first night, that Clive sat in the ICU waiting room making plans for a funeral, while I remained completely oblivious 2 hours away. I asked why Liam didn't tell me, and Clive gave me a look that made me feel about 2 inches tall. He said Liam was ashamed, that our family doesn't talk about hard things, that I'd spent 20 years making it clear weakness wasn't acceptable. The knowledge that my brother nearly died while I went about my normal life added another layer to the guilt I was already drowning in. Clive said Liam needed support, not judgment, that if I couldn't provide, that I should step back and let people who could actually help take over. Then he went back inside and left me standing in the garage with the full weight of how badly I'd failed everyone I was supposed to protect. Friday morning brought another consequence in my email inbox. Meal's calculus teacher wrote that he was in danger of not graduating even with summer school unless he showed major improvement in the next few weeks. She offered to tutor him twice a week if he committed to the work. Said she'd seen kids turn things around before, but it required real effort. I read the email 3 times, then hit reply immediately. I accepted the tutoring offer and asked what I could do to support the plan at home, whether he needed a quiet study space or help with specific concepts. I copied Meal on the response so he'd know I was taking this seriously, that I wasn't going to let him fail because I'd been too checked out to notice he was struggling. He came into my office 20 minutes later and stood in the doorway looking uncertain. He said he appreciated me responding so fast, but he needed to know I'd follow through, that he couldn't handle getting his hopes up about me being different, only to have me revert to ignoring everything again. I told him that was fair, and I'd prove it through consistent action, not just words. Saturday morning, we drove to Georgia's office for our first family therapy session. The waiting room had magazines nobody read, and a fish tank that Gus stared at instead of looking at any of us. Georgia called us back, and we filed into her office, everyone taking seats that put maximum distance between us. She had us arrange the chairs in a circle and started by creating ground rules. No interrupting, no name-calling. Everyone gets to speak without being talked over. Then she asked each person to share one thing they needed from this family to feel safe. The silence stretched out until Antigone finally spoke. She said she needed me to take her mental health seriously, to stop acting like anxiety was a character flaw she could overcome through willpower. Meal said he needed acceptance without conditions, that he couldn't keep hiding who he was to make me comfortable. Gus said he needed attention and structure, that he'd rather have rules and supervision than be ignored until he did something bad enough to force me to notice. Liam said he needed support without judgment, that recovery was hard enough without feeling like he had to hide his struggle to avoid disappointing people. Georgia turned to me and asked what I needed from this family. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The question had never occurred to me. I'd spent 17 years being the authority, making rules, expecting everyone to follow them, but I'd never considered I might need things too. The silence got uncomfortable, and everyone was staring at me, waiting for an answer I didn't have. Georgia waited patiently, and finally I admitted I didn't know, that I'd been so focused on being in charge that I never thought about what I needed. She asked me to sit with that discomfort for a minute, and then try again. I looked at my kids and my brother and my parents sitting against the wall observing, and I realized the only thing I needed was to learn how to be better at this. I said I needed to learn how to be a better father, that I needed help, because what I'd been doing clearly wasn't working. My voice cracked on the last word, and Antigone's expression softened slightly. Georgia nodded and said, "That was a good start, that recognizing we need help is the first step toward actually getting better." The session ended with Georgia assigning homework that sounded simple but felt overwhelming. I needed to spend one-on-one time with each kid doing something they chose, and we needed to have family dinners 3 times a week where everyone shared one good thing and one hard thing from their day. She said the point was to rebuild communication and trust through consistent small actions, not grand gestures. The kids looked skeptical, but agreed to try. On the drive home, nobody spoke, and I wondered if therapy was just going to be another thing I failed at, another place where my inadequacy got exposed and documented. Sunday dinner was our first attempt at Georgia's assignment. We sat around the table with plates of spaghetti nobody seemed hungry for, and the silence was thick and awkward. I started by sharing my good thing and my hard thing, trying to model what Georgia wanted. My good thing was that Liam was still sober and getting support from Clive. My hard thing was facing how much I'd failed everyone. Then I looked at Gus and asked him to go next. He pushed pasta around his plate and said his hard thing was that kids at the school were still talking about the video, making jokes about our family being a mess. His good thing was that his counselor was actually pretty cool and didn't treat him like a criminal, that talking to her was easier than he expected. Meal went next and said Henry's parents invited him for dinner next week, and he was nervous about meeting them. He worried they'd judge him for his family's problems or think he came from a bad home. His hard thing was that he failed another calculus quiz, even though he'd studied. Antigone said her good thing was that therapy actually helped, that having someone listen without telling her to toughen up made a difference. Her hard thing was that she still felt anxious all the time, that the coping tools Georgia taught her worked, but didn't make the anxiety disappear completely. Liam shared last, and his voice was quiet, but steady. He said he was 56 days sober, and his hard thing was looking for a job with a 6-month gap on his resume he didn't know how to explain. He'd been applying places but hadn't gotten any callbacks, and he worried his addiction would follow him forever, that he'd never be able to rebuild his life. I surprised myself by offering to help him practice interview responses that were honest, without oversharing, and he looked at me like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. Then he nodded and said, "That would be good. Thanks." The dinner ended, and we cleared plates together in silence that felt less hostile than before, like maybe we were learning how to exist in the same space without everything exploding. 2 weeks passed before Manfred Wagner came back to check on us. I watched him park his sedan in our driveway and walk up with his clipboard and files. He looked the same as before, professional and careful, like he was documenting everything for a report. He shook my hand at the door and asked to speak with each family member separately again. I led him to the dining room where this all started and offered him coffee. He declined. The kids were waiting in different rooms like we'd planned, nervous about what they'd say and whether we'd done enough. Manfred started with Antigone in her bedroom, while the rest of us waited downstairs. I could hear their voices through the ceiling, muffled but steady. She was up there for 20 minutes explaining the therapy sessions and showing him the medication management plan her therapist created. When she came down, her face was pale but relieved. Meal went next, then Gus, then Liam. Each interview took about 15 to 20 minutes. I paced in the kitchen while Manfred talked to my youngest son, wondering what Gus was telling him about our family dinners and whether a 13-year-old could be convincing about change he'd only seen for 2 weeks. When everyone else was done, Manfred called me into the dining room and closed the door. He sat across from me at the same table where everything exploded and opened his notes. The kids were positive about the changes, he said. Cautious, but positive. Antigone showed him her therapy progress and medication plan. Meal talked about calculus tutoring and feeling more accepted at home. Gus mentioned the school counseling and family dinners where everyone actually talked. Liam was maintaining his sobriety and attending meetings regularly. Manfred looked at me over his reading glasses and said he saw genuine effort, real progress in a short time. But then his expression shifted to something more serious. He was concerned, he said, that change motivated by CPS oversight might not stick once he closed the case. He'd seen families perform well during investigations and then backslide immediately after. The question was whether I understood that this wasn't about passing his evaluation. This was about fundamentally changing how I parent. I told him honestly that I was scared of going back to who I was before, that seeing my family nearly fall apart had changed something basic in how I understood being a father. I wasn't doing this for his reports or to avoid consequences. I was doing it because I finally saw what my rigid approach had done to my kids, the damage I'd caused by dismissing Antigone's mental health, by making Meal hide his identity, by being so checked out that Gus built an entire illegal operation without my notice. Manfred wrote notes while I talked. He asked what specific things I'd changed, and I listed them. Weekly therapy for everyone. Family dinners 3 times a week with real conversations. One-on-one time with each kid doing activities they chose. Actually listening when they talked instead of immediately lecturing. Accepting that I don't have all the answers and that asking for help isn't weakness. He nodded slowly and said he'd be back in a month for another check-in. He stood to leave and reminded me that his job was protecting kids, not punishing parents. If I kept doing the work, he'd see it. If I slipped back into old patterns, he'd see that too. The following Sunday, Meal brought Henry to family dinner again. It was still awkward, but better than their first meeting when everyone was walking on eggshells. Henry arrived carrying a container of cookies his mom baked, which Maggie accepted with warm thanks. We sat around the table with plates of chicken and rice that Antigone helped cook. The conversation started slow and careful. Gus broke the ice by asking Henry about video games, which got them talking about some multiplayer game I didn't understand. Antigone joined in cautiously, mentioning she played the same game sometimes. I watched Meal's shoulders drop incrementally as his boyfriend got included in normal family conversation. His face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before, like he was releasing tension he'd been carrying for months. Henry was polite and funny in a quiet way, making small jokes that got Gus laughing. He asked Antigone about her therapy in a way that felt genuine rather than nosy. He thanked Liam for passing the potatoes. Normal dinner table stuff that shouldn't have felt remarkable, but did, because this was the first time Meal's boyfriend sat at our table without everything being a disaster. I realized while watching them that Meal had spent 8 months using energy just to hide this relationship. 8 months of deleting texts and lying about where he was going and pretending Henry didn't exist whenever he was home. All that effort and fear because of words I'd said to Liam 20 years ago. The weight of that hit me again, while Henry asked Gus about his school counseling sessions. After dinner, Meal helped clear plates and quietly thanked me for being decent to Henry. I told him I was trying, and he said he could tell. It was a small moment, but it mattered more than I could explain. 3 weeks into summer school, an email arrived from Meal's calculus teacher. The subject line said, "Progress Update," and I opened it expecting bad news. Instead, she wrote that Meal was showing real improvement and would likely pass if he maintained his current effort. His quiz scores were climbing, and he was asking good questions during tutoring sessions. She was impressed by his commitment to fixing his academic situation. I printed the email and showed Meal when he got home that afternoon. His face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. He read it twice, then looked at me with something like pride mixed with relief. I suggested we celebrate with ice cream, just the two of us, and he agreed. We drove to the ice cream place near the high school and got cones, then sat at one of the outdoor tables. Meal talked about Henry and their plans for junior year. He wanted to take Henry to homecoming if I was okay with that. I said of course, though the thought still made me slightly uncomfortable, which I was learning to recognize as my problem to work through. He told me about college applications and how he hoped to study engineering. He talked about Henry's dream of becoming a teacher, normal teenage future planning that I'd missed because I'd been too busy judging and controlling. The ice cream melted faster than we could eat it in the summer heat. Meal laughed when mine dripped on my shirt. It was easy and normal and exactly what I should have been doing with my son all along. Henry's parents invited me to meet them for coffee the following week. I drove to the cafe they suggested, nervous in a way I hadn't expected. They were already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table. Henry's father stood to shake my hand with a grip that felt like a test. His mother smiled, but her eyes were evaluating. We ordered coffee and sat down to talk. They were polite but direct. They wanted to know if I was truly accepting of Meal's identity, or just tolerating it because I had to. They asked about the viral video and whether my views had actually changed or if I was performing for CPS. Henry's mother said her son really cared about Meal, and she needed to know he wasn't going to get hurt by a family that couldn't accept him. I admitted I was still working through my own biases, that I grew up with certain views and unlearning them was harder than I'd expected, but I was committed to doing that work because I loved my son more than I loved being comfortable. I told them about the things I'd said to Liam 20 years ago and how those words had shaped Meal's fear of coming out, how I was trying to be different now, but I understood why they were protective. Henry's father relaxed slightly. He told me about his own path to accepting his son's sexuality, how it challenged assumptions he didn't know he had, how it ultimately made their relationship stronger because it forced him to see his son as a complete person rather than who he wanted him to be. His honesty helped me see that discomfort during growth was normal, that I didn't have to be perfect immediately as long as I was genuinely trying. We talked for over an hour. By the end, Henry's mother said she appreciated my willingness to be honest about my struggles. She said growth was a process, and she'd be watching to see if I followed through. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. Liam hit 70 days sober, and we celebrated at his recovery center's family night. The center was a plain building with fluorescent lights and chairs arranged in a circle. Other families were there supporting their loved ones. Liam stood up when it was his turn and talked about his journey. 70 days felt impossible 3 months ago. He credited family support and his sponsor and the structure of meetings. He looked at me when he said, having somewhere stable to live made recovery feel less scary. After the meeting, other people approached to congratulate him. I met parents supporting their addicted kids, spouses supporting their partners, siblings supporting their brothers and sisters. Everyone had stories about overdoses and relapses and the daily work of staying clean. Hearing them talk helped me understand that Liam's addiction wasn't a moral failure. It was a disease that required ongoing management and support, like diabetes or any other chronic condition. One woman told me about her daughter who'd been sober for 2 years after nearly dying from fentanyl. A man talked about his son who relapsed 4 times before it finally stuck. They all emphasized that support from family made the difference between giving up and trying again. Liam introduced me to his sponsor, an older guy named Frank, who'd been sober for 12 years. Frank told me that early recovery was fragile and that Liam would need consistent support for months, probably years, that the family's job was to be present without enabling, supportive without controlling. I thanked him and promised to keep showing up. At our next family therapy session, Georgia noted that our communication had improved significantly over the past 2 months. She asked what we'd each learned about each other through this process. Antigone spoke first, saying she learned that asking for help doesn't make her weak, that needing support is normal, and trying to handle everything alone just made things worse. Neil said he learned that people can change if they're willing to do the work, that his dad wasn't the same person who said those things to Uncle Liam, or at least he was trying not to be. Gus said he learned that getting attention through bad behavior isn't as satisfying as getting attention through honest connection, that the gambling operation made him money, but it didn't make him feel less alone. Liam said he learned that family support makes sobriety feel less impossible, that hiding his addiction in shame almost killed him, but sharing it in therapy gave him a reason to keep fighting. Georgia turned to me and asked what I'd learned. I thought about it for a minute. I said I learned that being a good father means listening more than lecturing and supporting more than controlling, that my kids don't need me to have all the answers. They need me to be present and willing to help them find their own answers. That love requires action, not just feeling. That I'd caused real damage with my rigidity and dismissiveness, but I could also repair some of that damage by showing up consistently and doing the work. 6 weeks after the viral dinner, Manfred Wagner came back for his final assessment. He interviewed everyone again, reviewed our therapy attendance records, checked Antigone's medication management plan, confirmed Meal's academic progress, verified Liam's sobriety milestones. He spent 3 hours going through everything with the same careful attention he'd shown before. When he finished, he called me into the dining room alone. He was closing the case, he said. The family had made enough progress to satisfy CPS requirements, but he warned me that backsliding was common, that families often relaxed once oversight ended and fell back into old patterns. He gave me a folder of resources for continued support, including therapy referrals, support groups, and crisis hotlines. He made clear that just because the case was closed didn't mean the work was done. This was a beginning, not an ending. I thanked him and promised to keep going. He looked at me seriously and said he hoped so, for my kids' sake. Then he packed up his files and left. I stood in the driveway watching his car disappear down the street, feeling relieved and scared at the same time. Relieved that CPS was done monitoring us. Scared that without that external pressure, I might slip back into being the father I was before. I went inside and found my kids in the living room. I told them Manfred closed the case. They looked relieved too, but also uncertain, like they were wondering the same thing I was wondering, whether I'd keep trying once no one was watching. I showed them I was trying by being there every day. I picked Antigone up from therapy appointments instead of making her take the bus. I sat at the kitchen table while Meal worked through calculus problems, not helping unless he asked, but present, so he knew I cared. I drove Gus to his counseling sessions at the school and waited in the parking lot instead of dropping him off and leaving. Small actions that added up to something bigger than words. 2 weeks later, Antigone came home from therapy with different news than usual. She dropped her backpack by the door and found me in the kitchen making dinner. Georgia wanted to reduce their sessions to every other week instead of weekly. Antigone's coping skills had improved enough that she didn't need as much support anymore. Her anxiety was better managed. She could handle situations that used to make her panic. I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at my daughter, who was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. She told me she was proud of the progress she'd made. Then she said she was glad I finally listened when she told me she needed help. The words hurt and healed at the same time. I apologized again for not listening sooner, for making her find illegal ways to get the care she needed. She nodded and said she knew I was sorry, that she could see it in how I showed up now. That mattered more than the apology. Meal's final calculus grade came through in early August. B-. Not perfect, but enough to graduate and keep his college options open. His teacher emailed me separately to say she was impressed by his turnaround. She'd seen a lot of students struggle with summer school, but Meal showed real maturity and determination. He'd committed to fixing his situation instead of giving up. I forwarded the email to Meal, and he called me from Henry's house where he'd been spending the afternoon. His voice sounded lighter than it had in months. He said he'd been scared he wouldn't make it, that failing would prove I was right to doubt him. I told him I never doubted he could do the work. I just hadn't been paying attention to whether he needed help. That was my failure, not his. He was quiet for a moment, then said he appreciated that. We were learning how to talk to each other without everything becoming a fight. Gus finished his school counseling requirement the same week. The counselor called to give me her assessment. He'd shown real growth in understanding why he'd sought control through gambling. He was starting to recognize the patterns that made him act out. She recommended he continue therapy privately to address the underlying issues. She thought he'd benefit from longer-term support. When I talked to Gus about it that evening, I expected resistance. Instead, he shrugged and said, "Okay," just like that. He told me the counseling actually helped, that having someone to talk to who wasn't family made it easier to be honest. I asked if he wanted to pick his own therapist, or if he wanted help finding someone. He said he'd think about it. The fact that he was willing to continue without fighting me felt like progress. I didn't want to jinx by pushing. Liam hit 90 days sober on a Saturday in late August. We threw a small gathering in the backyard with just family. Maggie made Liam's favorite dessert. Oscar grilled burgers. Clive drove up from 2 hours away to be there. The kids helped set up tables and chairs without complaining. When everyone had food, Clive stood up to make a speech. He talked about watching Liam struggle with addiction for years, about the fear that he'd get a call saying his brother was gone. He said seeing Liam fight for his recovery made him proud in ways he couldn't fully express. That having family support seemed to make Liam believe he could actually stay sober long-term. Liam started crying halfway through the speech. When Clive finished, Liam stood up and said, 90 days felt impossible a few months ago. He'd tried to get sober before and never made it this far. The difference this time was knowing he wasn't fighting alone. That family support made him want to stay clean. He looked at me when he said it, and I nodded, trying to show him I understood what he was telling me. 3 months after the viral dinner, we planned another family meal. This time it was intentional instead of obligatory. Everyone contributed to cooking. Meal made salad. Antigone handled the pasta. Gus set the table without being asked. I worked on the sauce while Liam prepped garlic bread. Henry came over early to help, moving around our kitchen like he belonged there. The conversation flowed naturally instead of feeling forced. Gus told a story about something funny that happened at the school. Antigone shared a meme that made everyone laugh. Meal and Henry talked about a movie they wanted to see. Even Liam seemed relaxed, joking with Clive about something from their childhood. I watched my family interact and realized this was what dinner should have felt like all along. Not performance or obligation, but genuine connection. We sat down to eat, and the atmosphere stayed easy. Henry fit naturally into our dynamic, adding to conversations without dominating them. Gus seemed relaxed instead of cynical, actually smiling at jokes instead of making cutting remarks. Antigone shared that she'd been thinking about starting a mental health awareness club at her school. She wanted to help other kids who might be struggling like she had. Create a space where people could talk about anxiety and depression without shame. Meal said he wanted to volunteer with an LGBTQ youth organization. Help younger kids who were scared to come out, show them it gets better. I told them both I was proud of them for wanting to turn their pain into purpose. That using their experiences to help others showed real strength and maturity. After dinner, Liam and I ended up on the back porch while everyone else cleaned up inside. We sat in the same chairs we'd used as kids when our parents owned this house, back before life got complicated. Liam told me he'd been sober for 98 days. He had a job interview next week at a warehouse. Nothing fancy, but honest work with decent pay. He seemed nervous but hopeful about it. I told him about my own therapy sessions where I was working on the prejudices and rigidity that had hurt my family, learning to recognize when my discomfort was my problem to solve, not everyone else's problem to accommodate. Liam was quiet for a minute, then said he was proud of me for being willing to change, that watching me do the work made him believe people really could become better versions of themselves. We sat there as the sun went down, not needing to fill the silence with more words. Through the kitchen window, I could see my family moving around inside. Gus was teaching Henry some kind of card game, both of them laughing at something. Meal and Antigone had their phones out, showing each other something that made them crack up. Maggie and Oscar were helping with dishes, my mother washing while my father dried. This family looked different from the one that had imploded 3 months ago. We weren't the family we were before that dinner, and that was actually a good thing. That family had been breaking under the weight of secrets and shame. everyone hiding parts of themselves because they didn't feel safe being honest. This family was messy and imperfect, and still figuring things out, but it was built on honesty and effort and the daily choice to show up for each other. The viral video would always exist as a record of our worst moment. 50,000 people had watched my family fall apart in real time, but it was also the catalyst that forced us to become the family we should have been all along. Healing wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about building something better from the wreckage.